Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Laurie Zoloth, and she is one of these people whose kind of disciplinary expertise spans a very wide range. So she's Professor of Bioethics and Humanities at the Feinberg School of Medicine, but she's also Professor of Religion and member of the Jewish Studies faculty at the Weinberg College of Arts and Science. She's been, in the recent past, the president of the American Academy of Religion, the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, and the vice president of the Society for Jewish Ethics. And for 6 years, she served as the first ethicist on NASA's National Advisory Board. So you can see her interests span this wide field. And we're delighted that you're going to speak to us on an ethics for the coming storm. So that's an enigmatic title, but we look forward to hearing it.
So one of the things I want to say is that I am a bioethicist, and normally I think about things like human genomes, cloning, those cutting-edge emerging technologies, nanotechnology. But I set aside that because I felt very strongly that my colleagues in science were spending all of their time thinking about climate change. And they turned to me in religious studies and said, what are you doing about climate change? And one of the books out there, the 6 Degrees book, the Colbert book, these early books on climate change really changed my idea about what was the primary ethical issue I could talk about. And as president of the American Academy of Religion, which is a meeting of 10,000 people, small for science, big for humanities, I have a chance to set the tone for an entire year of study. And I decided to do it on the ethical issues and religious issues of climate change. And this was the talk that I gave at the end of that year of study, which largely happened here at Clare Hall in Cambridge for me, which I read, like our colleague this morning, Bishop James, this emerging literature on what exactly is happening to us and why I think it's the single most important bioethical problem, and a problem that religion needs to confront because scientists need religion, needs the language and the theories of religious thought, as I'll try to prove in this paper, to fully address climate change. So, but first, I have a task for you. Can you see this? Yes? Okay. So you've been sitting all day. I want you to turn to your neighbor, each other, the face to the, and I want you to talk about those two biblical verses, scriptural verses, one from Hebrew Scriptures, Genesis 5, and one from Surah 71 from the Quran. Okay, just talk for a minute about what you think about these two verses. Thank you. What you've just done is you've enacted two different practices. One is approximating the hum of study in a classic yeshiva study hall. When you walk in, people are studying in pairs, sugyot, people who have ruta, they're studying with each other, face to face, and arguing about a text. That's what happens in yeshivas, studying the Talmud. And here you also replicated the experience of what's called scriptural reasoning, a practice that began and is largely rooted in Cambridge, which is comparing the scriptural stories of Hebrew Bible, New Testament, and the Quran. And here you have a similar story in the Quran and the Hebrew Bible of this enormous event that happened to humanity, which is when humanity somehow failed utterly morally and were ended in some fundamental way. So this is the prologue for our discussion about the coming storm. And this is our generation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, issued a report today that says the effects of climate change are already occurring on all continents and across the oceans, saying human influence on the climate systems is clear and growing. The gathering risks of climate change are so profound that they could reverse generations of progress against poverty and hunger. If greenhouse gas emissions continue at a runaway pace, the groups of scientists and other experts found, society faces food shortages, refugee crises, the flooding of major cities and entire island nations, the mass extinction of plants and animals, and a climate so drastically altered it might become dangerous for people to work or play outside. One, the last place. We are living in the last place. There is no other world for us, no second chance. This one world is so beautiful, with the sweet green willows shushing in the August breeze and the halting diamond turns of water from small plastic sprinklers. the ordinary grace of a swerve of bright white birds and the spun net of high floating clouds. The blue-green weed, called miner's lettuce, abundant in the sidewalks of the city. The way that wood rubs gold from use, the crack of a hammer, clear and high, the sway of each of us on the train in wet wool coats, the old man down the alley whistling a song he learned as a boy. Seed time and harvest time, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, always and again. We have covered the earth so we can drive the buses and the cars, made this last place we have a good place for driving around, for working, and so much of the work is good. And here are all the usual things we know, that this is a world so clean and easy for people with wealth, and so hard and dirty for the poor. The seas are polluted with the nitrogen fertilizer. The forests are chopped for paper. Species are blinkering out. We already know this. We sound the depths, we dig up what is left of life crushed to the carbon beneath us, and we burn it to make important things, really, hospital intensive care units, synthetically derived insulin, and steel beams for the new high school library. But we burn it for nothing, too, really, for vanity and emptiness, and the tracing of that smoke lies over us now, invisible, warming the oceans, then the air, and then all of us in this last place. Nothing about the usual things we know, the essential, terrible injustice of us all, has stopped the burning. In fact, this year, we loaded up the air with more carbon than ever. We have been told this clearly, it is deadly, and it has yet not made us change one thing. Our lives continue, seamless, lucky. But we have gotten that IPCC warning letter, and for scholars of religion, we hear this as a prophecy. A storm is coming. It is already on our own horizon. It has been coming for years. The first mention of the fact that human beings might be changing the nature of the air, the term for weather in Hebrew, came in 1957, written exactly in San Diego by Roger Revelle, founder of UCSD, the college there, and the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. Now it was clear he was prescient. Let me first say it in the words of the large and serious consensus body of the scientists who've been researching this issue for the last 30 years, whose chairman actually came to the AR to speak. Human influence on the climate system is unequivocal. Greenhouse gases are at the highest level in human history. The changes are unprecedented and will cause long-lasting changes in all components of the climate system, increasingly severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts on people and our ecosystems. And let me say it plainly too. Every single thing we study takes place in a world in which the climate has been essentially stable and predictable for 10,000 years. Every text written, every idea about faith, every song sung or harvest planted has been created in this last place. And we have already changed the world for the next 1,000 years, even if we do everything now. Now at stake is only how very bad it will be. After this talk, I want you to remember that no one can say, I just didn't know it was happening. And that's my goal here, and was my goal as the president of the world's largest organization of scholars of religion, and as one of America's largest scholarly organizations. As an American bioethicist, I wanted everyone to face the central moral imperative of our time. Climate change and the way it threatened the lives of the most vulnerable ought to be this critical focus of our scholarship, thought, speak, and action in our field. I wanted us to mark this day and this moment that I say to you, here is where we stopped. Here is where we started to change things. But what would actually make you stop? What would interrupt your life? And what do I mean by interruption? The idea of interruption is about both betweenness, inter, and brokenness, rupture. So to interrupt is to stop the continuous progress of action, to stop someone speaking, to break the continuity of a line, or to block a view. To be a being is to be a being living in the illusion of a life that is continuous, busy, one process. We are committed to continuity, to historicity, to plans, to prospects, to the order of things, their repetition, and patterns and sequences. We expect, rather touchingly, that we live in a consistent progressive narrative, and that the interruption of being is a break in the story we want to resume. We have made promises, we have bought tickets, we have a book contract, we need quiet for our mindfulness, and not that noisy kid. We resent interruption because of this narrative ideal, that we have an important product to produce, even if the product is some unit of reflection, and to be interrupted is to be taken or snatched from our work to some other call. To be interrupted is to be broken. It is to have one's view blocked by something that one does not want to see, say the beggar, or to have one's professing, one's declaration, one's own story stopped by a disagreement perhaps, or even by someone calling out for help, a question orthogonal to your own. If we are to understand the character of our being as temporal, if we're to create a theory that can respond decently to the question of how we ought to live now, how we ought to live in a world that is burning, it must be a theory that emerges out of our actual praxis, not our fantasy narrative of the pristine journey. The arc of the universe bends toward justice, we learned from Martin Luther King, but it is not an unbroken line, and our pulling makes it crack and fissure. We live in the spaces between the ruptures. The world as we know it is not flat, yet it is altogether flattened into a series of ceaseless falsities, and in their quotidian necessity, they make us despair. It is the world of totality, and we tell ourselves a story of seamless desire, each little event, each little trial, each little flattery presenting as if we were the only ones in the room with our particular victory just ahead. Here is what it means to be modern. We believe that everything can be under control, ordered in advance, the costs and the benefits all weighed up. But into our lives, and utterly out of our control or our will, comes the complete otherness of interruption. It is a surprise that we understand interruption as a problem, the distraction of being within a world of necessary order, the chaos of the otherness of being. All that is not yourself comes knocking at your door. All that is not work comes calling, just when you're writing out your big idea. For what are we interrupted? There are the 1,000 small serious interruptions. There are the questions of students and their needs. There's the constant interruption which goes by the name of administration. There are petty cascades of email, the sense of news constantly on a crawl beneath the actual work of our lives. There are bodies that need ordinal tending, children, the old, everyone who needs us to look at their drawing or to attend to the wound, to lift them up in our arms now. For what are we interrupted? For the grandest dramas and the greatest joys, for the befallenness of illness, the birth of children, for true love, for desperate need. This is the deep practice of interruption, and if you are a moral being, you will have done well to be a being who is broken off and who is stopped. This is so vividly true about our lives that it is obvious, but unseen. Something we know when no one asks us, something we need to remind ourselves. It is the task of philosophy. We are interrupted by the insistent call of God, theologically. And when we respond rightly, it is in prayer, or it is in action for the widow and the orphan. It is standing and saying, Hineni, I am here. Yet it's hard to respond rightly, and from this we flee in terror, not as moderns to be sure, into fish or Tarshish or deserts, but into work. We flee into meetings and Netflix and grant applications. In my field, bioethics, we seek out ever more unlikely cases or consider obscure fears about the improbable technologies, all the places we go when we're in flight. We are in flight and the world is tiny and distant and far away. We are in flight, even people who should know better, people who really actually read the prophets, we are off to our metaphorical caves because who wants this interruption, this reminder, this politics? A theology of interruption demands that we attend to the interruption as if the interruption were the real and the other stuff of our lives the distraction. How to live with such a theological ethics, attention to the call of the other and alert always to the call of God without seeming like a madwoman or a religious fanatic. What would such a life look like? For a Jew, of course, there is Shabbat, the Sabbath, made ever more utter a stop in time because of the constancy of the machines that we admire and pet and constantly speak into. In that interruption, we turn only to one another or to Torah or to the grammar of prayer. This is probably too romanticized a version, for we also eat and complain, we're Jews, but it's not a trivial act in modernity to make the Sabbath a sign, to honor the interruption. And for any reader of Hebrew scripture, there is the commanded interruption of the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, the year of agricultural release, when every 6 years all agricultural work stops. The fields are left fallow, and every living creature, animal and person, can eat from any field and any vineyard and any place in the wide open world, where the boundaries of ownership and possession are broken, so that the poor can take whatever they need when all debts are released. It is a practice, by the way, that's not metaphorical, but describes an actual theopolitical economy, and it was in force in 2014. It will be again in 2021, Jews around the world, and also, of course, in Israel. These are acts of practice, the acts of attention within a lived community of faith. These interruptions are signifiers that each of us, a people in an actual place and standing next to actual other people, can act even partially and even briefly, as if you heard something or someone or something that is not sold, not quantitatively measured or advertised, something that actually matters. To interrupt your life is a theological claim. Now let me argue too that there's texts of many scriptures, surely Hebrew scripture, the New Testament and the Quran, are written as an argument with in-between narratives and lacuna and ruptures and people speaking back, leaving room for centuries of responsa, commentary, fierce public fights, and academic scholarship. As scriptural readers, there are texts in which narrative after narrative, the given stable hierarchies of power, the natural order of the empirical world, and the dark, steady pull of cultural customs, even the sequences of the story, are interrupted. So let me turn to some examples, and there's many in the Torah. First, the great flood test that we started with, I've asked you to consider. The pivotal story of Abraham, who interrupts, according to medieval commentary Rashi, a conversation with God to attend to 3 strangers who show up hungry at his tent. And then, of course, the story of the daughters of Zoloth. For the rabbis of the Talmud, the question of interruption is one of fascinating concern. In repeated and prolonged and difficult discussions, difficult discussions, the rabbis debate when interruption is permitted, on the Sabbath, on the public reading of the Torah, on a Nazirite vow, or in study, work, or prayer. Interruption is, of course, the very method of teaching and learning and ethical decision-making in Jewish thought. And one can interrupt with one story on story and story, each disagreement challenging the half-finished sentence of the previous argument. I'm going to give you an example in a minute. So perhaps a life lived in the midst of interruption is exactly what the point is of such a theological discourse. Now consider the scene of the great interruption in rabbinic literature. One day, the house of study was suddenly open to all. To everyone that is poor, the ugly, the uncertain, a great interruption of the hierarchy of learning that was the very center of rabbinic Jewish life after the Roman destruction of the Second Temple. Here's a lesson about an enormous interruption. On one day, the rules of the language game and the admission standards of the rabbinic study hall were upended. On that day, the halls of the academy were open to everyone. So many came. Maybe 400 came, maybe 700, maybe more. Despite the shock response of Rabbi Gamliel, the wealthy leader, as an entire tractate of the Talmud was created that day. And every question of the law was answered with certainty, the closest thing to a miraculous event for Jews. Even the terms of race are undone. An Ammonite can enter the hall of study, for colonialization has interrupted fixed biological lineages, insists this text. Gamaliel goes to ask for forgiveness because he's not fully understood the depths of these changes and sees the terrible poverty of his colleague, Rabbi Joshua, who works at the most desperate of jobs, burning wood into carbon, making charcoal. And the story ends with a critical claim about study itself. The teachers must understand the lives of the poor and interrupt their professing with these facts. Look at the blackened walls of the homes of the poor, learn from the very poorest. The passion for interruption on behalf of the poor continues later in medieval texts, where prayer can be interrupted for a claim of injustice. In this 9th century text of interruption, the leadership of the Ashkenazi community deep within the long exile in Western Europe hears a case and decides the matter. But the man or the woman who is the subject of the decision is unhappy, and she is determined even when no one in power will listen to her. So she will take her claim to the synagogue and interrupt the prayer to demand, listen to me. This is a really remarkable moment in Jewish law. It's about a woman, right, in the medieval period, a method by which a judgment can be challenged by an interruption in a holy place of a holy act. What is suggested is an astonishing moral gesture, especially given the elaborate rabbinic limits on interruption in the communal speech of prayer. But clearly there's a tension between prayer and the needs of others. In the medieval text, it's suggested that the act of justice, the interruption of justice, is a part of the service. It's a radical claim, but it's a clear echo of the day of the great interruption attend to the situation of the poor, to see her in the Talmud, the demand to interrupt even prayer. So what do these kind of long narratives and elaborate practices tell us about how to be good, about the worth of our lives in a burning time? Why do the rabbis worry about interruption and its protection? Why do I say to you, you must interrupt your life? To be interrupted is to acknowledge the power of the other over your being, to see the interrupting, messy, needy other as entitled to your full attention. But because we do not have a clear account of how you ought to live as a good person in a time of climate chaos, And because full attention is so hard, we struggle to defend what looks like a series of affections or hobbies. Is there any way to articulate a foundational theory behind climate sustainability actions of that personal sort? To argue for the need for interruption is to advocate for a moral chronology. We are beings who not only live in a particular location, we live within a time that we order and sort another sort of accountancy. How we order time, how we understand ourselves as having a past that leads to a present that promises a future is always an interpretive moral choice, albeit one that seems to us to be utterly invisible and already given. The clearest advocate for this recognition is Walter Benjamin, who alerts us to how we see time, how we experience it as empty space along which we endlessly travel, which aligns us with a sort of secular passivity. Progress, emotional growth, economic growth, more units of things, the storm catches up our desires and our stuff. Benjamin sees that empty time as a homogeneous continuum of moments which have no goal and finally no subject. This sort of secular time has to be arrested. The thinking that it enables, indeed necessitates, has to be interrupted. How unlike the radical breaks of religious texts, the sun that stops in the center of the sky, the prophets who unmake history in the narrative of subjugation. How unlike the Jewish view of time, Benjamin insists, where every second was the straight gate through which the Messiah entered. Empty time colludes with institutions that say, it's just always been like this, it's just so impossible to change. It creates people who only yearn for things to stay exactly like they've always been. Yet we know that sustaining a world of endless, repeated injustice and always unthinking moment ahead is already a problem. Argues Benjamin, uninterrupted time expels any subjective expectation and thus engenders that fatalism that eats at the souls of modern women and men, writing in 1936. That fatalism and that acceptance. But time can be interrupted at any point by redemption. An exodus can begin, slavery can end, a bush can burn, a Messiah can be revealed at the gates of the city hanging around with the lepers. That's not only a Jewish assertion, it's one that's widely held in religious texts. The premise then is larger than acting well as an individual, for I am responsible for my neighbor's pledge, says philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, responsible for her as well. We act responsibly, not out of fear of the future, though any rational person should, in this point in time, be quite sobered by what the scientists are telling us. The premise is that interruption of time, in the sense that Benjamin meant, leads to the creation of a sort of person, you, with the virtues to which we aspire, but also to an argument that might convince other people. And that is the sort of person that is capable of acting as a moral citizen. The storm is coming, and I am not an engineer. All we have is words and the capacity to think, as Hannah Arendt insists. We must think quite clearly now about our situation. To perform ethics is to think about how to be good. And all of the complex work we do, all the research, is to know the story of how people struggled and spoke and wrote and heard that question. How are we? How am I going to live a good life? Now, how ought I to live when the world is burning? How to reclaim this sort of thinking from stupid trivialities or caricature? One way might be to avoid the easy tropes, both the rainbow promises and the apocalyptic threats. But the one I want to suggest is to think about the interruption as an ethical choice based on the actualities of our human lives in this time, when always there is that knock at the door, and despite all of our fears to be good, it is to open that door and welcome the stranger. Thinking about interruption, the stopping, the hearing, leads to thinking about hospitality, the acts of speech and welcome. Because climate change transformed the world, there will be exile, and there will be strangers on the move. We must think about welcome, and we must stop, get up, and make the move to answer. For we are the only ones left, and this, our home, it is the last place for the traveler. So a theology of interruption as an ethics for the coming storm. But now, what do I do? So there's three ways in which we have to do now: act as citizens, as individuals, and scholars. So first we must think and act as individuals. Now it's not going to be enough, and when we act as individuals with our little ordinal choices, it will feel futile against the scale of icebergs and thousand-year floods. It is true that the scale of our individual actions, even if every single one of us refuses meat, abandons our car, insulates and light bulbs and recycles, it still won't be enough. But how are we to live unless we stop, one by one, and stand like objects of resistance, like interruptions in the flow of the river of history, breaking the rushing lines and disrupt? If I don't do this, who do I imagine will do it? There are many reasons to act beyond the calculation of benefit or payoff, of course. We are shaped by our acts, says Aristotle, our bodies, our homes, and our organizations, and one reason we act is to create a life worth living, a life of meaning and courage. So an act of stopping will shape me, and the act of unthinking consumption, well, that will shape me too. I am a Californian, and I grew up in a curl of the Pacific coast, in a cove called La Costa, which ironically means my home, where the sea has now risen, and the storms are now newly terrible, and the rocks are now bleached acid white. Every time I act for my home, and this should be true for every single one of us. What I do, how I live, is a moral act, every single gesture I make. And while our gestures seem innocent, they are cumulative, and they set in motion a chain of action that, given the structures of exchange, is part of the systematic order of the world. And the world has shaped the production and exchange and consumption of the goods that the wealthiest have garnered the vast majority of wealth, burning the vast majority of carbon at the expense of the lives and the health of the poor. And we are the sort of creatures with a plight into which we are born, which is that we cannot not act. There is no doing nothing, for the doing of nothing is a something, is a moral act, one in which you support the existing constructs of carbon use and the policies of the energy companies, and it looks for all the world like you were then acting as if you have a duty to them, and that one duty that you enact every single time you get into the car or eat the steak. Second, we must think and act as citizens. For Hannah Arendt, the public speech, the speech to one another which disturbs and breaks into the power of totality, is both political and ontological. It's an act of civil disobedience that creates the institutions of a larger democracy. Consent, freedom, all of this is contingent on the fact that we could protest if we wanted to, and that's what makes a democracy. We could enter the event of the polis, and we could speak to stop it. And the reverse, of course, is also the case. If we don't speak up, if we don't stop, if we don't partake of what is being said, then we sustain the givenness of the order, an order so convenient for us and so terrible for too many. Terrible by one in too many places, child by child. Can you not hear them at your door? Now let me expand on this idea of civil interruption, that we must act as citizens in addition to acting as individuals. I'll turn to a distinction made by Arendt in her consideration of civil disobedience. Individual act, she argues, Socrates' refusals and Thoreau's protests, while infinitely appealing, are ultimately subjective. Thoreau himself, by the way, is happy with his conscience being clear and is one day in jail in which he refuses to pay taxes to a state that allows slavery and war. It's very noble but personal, and by the way, his buddies bail him out and quietly pay the tax. Thoreau writes that when we come into this world not chiefly to make it a good place to live in, but to live in it, be it good or bad. And Arendt understands the limits of his personal choice this way. Indeed, this is how we all come into the world, lucky if the world and the part of it we arrive in is a good place at the time of our arrival. But what if it is a place where the wrongs committed are of such a nature that it requires you to be an agent of injustice, she asks. For if this one is the case, then I say, you must break the law. This idea, the tension between being a good person and being a good citizen, between morality and politics, is as old as the idea of the state, Arendt notes, as old as the city in which Socrates teaches. The thinking person must think of the judgment of others and of the interior integrity of the self. But there's a problem with this strategy, and it is why if we only recycle our cups and only bike to work, we're still not finished with our duties in this burning time. Ultimately, she argues, individual acts remain subjective and self-interested, like choices in the marketplace, hard to justify. Arendt wants more than the individual interruption. She wants public action. She wants civil disobedience, meaning organizations. It is when minorities band together, make a decision, and take a stand that states can be changed. When the defiance of established authority can be the outstanding event. When persons act as citizens in the name of and for a group on the ground of basic dissent, not as individuals. To be a citizen, to actually change things in a democracy, is to seize the deadly serious duty of continuing participation in all matters of public interest. This participation, this voice, this interruption of the business taking place in the public square. This is all that free people have. And we must activist participation matters beyond a noble loneliness. And that requires a great deal from us, especially if we're the sort of citizens that are not used to thinking in this way, or a sort of scholars who are worried about being too political, who are willing to forego some comforts, to be sure, but not entirely sure we want to risk what is so dear to us, our work, our profession, our professing to be so political. And third, we must think and act as teachers. For doesn't the question of the other, the one who has not arrived in a lucky place, emerge from our own scholarship? Isn't that the point of knowing that the stranger and widow and orphan are at the door, that the mendicant needs alms, that the land needs a year of release? We must live as if ready, say the texts we teach. We must live if we were chosen to uphold the law, to be the person who comes in love, who asks even about the city of Sodom. Who will do this if not the teachers that we are? Letting the danger and the power and the endless mercy of religion to be excellently told is the task of the scholar of religion. To teach religion excellently is to engage in the public examination of things. The task of the scholar since Socrates spoke his truth to the academy, says Arendt. And our teaching, if it's actually parrhesia, truth-telling, should raise the questions that will doubtless interrupt the usual way of things, which in our academy would mean disrupt the institutions that govern us, the ratio and the episteme of the marketplace, a marketplace devoted to the continuous expansion, whatever the cost. And we have a duty, if we're scholars, that emerges from the blunt fact that in scriptural texts that we think are important, the point is made over and over again. Your moral activities can affect the rain, the harvest, the health of everything you love. The link between moral choices and material outcomes is made continually, and is received and studied toward normative action. Hebrew texts, the Quran, the New Testament, suggest the interruption of the desire, of consumption, and of acquisition. They link that interruption to the order of the natural world, of harvest time and planting. Our scholarly behavior is a part of this, for unless we see the world of the charcoal burner, our work is lacking. What could I do to interrupt you, to pull you over and make you attend to this crisis? Really, there's nothing I can say to anyone who reads the daily news that does not already know, except this: we must stop. We must be interrupted by this. To make the future possible, we need to stop what we're doing, what we are making, what we are consuming, what we think we need, what makes us comfortable. We need to interrupt our work, even our good work, to attend to the urgency of this question. For it is one that needs a coherent answer, an answer we have not yet seen. Is our society unable to stop careening towards the deep trouble of the coming storm because we have not fully attended, just because we cannot stop? Listen to the language of the latest IPCC report. The mass die-offs of forests, the melting of land ice around the world, an accelerating rise of the seas that's leading to the increased coastal flooding, and heat waves that have devastated crops and killed tens of thousands of people, all happening already, not a generation from now. The scenes of flooding are familiar if you live in the wake of Hurricane Sandy or the hurricane that wiped out thousands in the Philippines, but they are familiar and resonant as for scholars of religion as well. We know that language of flood. So let me turn to the text that you've just studied to come finish. Genesis 6:5 begins in the middle of the story, in despair, the thoughts of the heart of a watching God. And he saw the very imaginings of the heart of humans were nothing but evil every single day. So much evil by the humans. The very earth, his last place, she is ruined, he says, who regrets in the text. She is ruined by men. It is done in the front of his face, bipanim, violently. And look, even I, will bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy every living being from under the heavens. Everything on the earth shall die. In the Quran, there's a chance, a warning, an invitation to truth. We sent Noah in Surah 71. It is not only the Abrahamic text that will tell a story of a vast flood that destroys some great wickedness or chaos, but in Gilgamesh, in Plato, in the Theology of Bibliotea, in the Irish story of the Keser, in the Finnish Caravella, in the Kovan Madupti Masai and Yoruba narratives. In India, the flood is told. In China, it is called Gangyo. In Malaysia, the Kalev. For Thais, Kun Buram. There's a great flood told by the Hopi, by the Mayan, and by the Incas. In Chile, it is in Trenton Vilu in Peru, a flood and a rainbow, and the waters running out in the huge waterfalls of Bogota. Let me be frank, in the tradition of the Hebrew Bible, it is not a happy or redemptive tale. And after the catastrophe, the narrative ends exactly where it began. God watching the words belev, belevo in his heart, I will not kill the living beings as I did. We are left with the faintest of hope, a rainbow that vanishes, that barely lasts until we turn. A few lines later, with the prophet Noah naked and drunk and silent, in a world which will continue endlessly, ceaselessly, without interruption, wrapped in its own spiral, until all of the days of the earth, and seed and harvest, and cold and warmth, and summer and winter, and day and night, no, they shall not cease, lo Shabbato, no Sabbath. And into this world full of tempted and broken people, where not even childhood is innocent, that's the world in which we live. We don't live in Eden. We who believe in science believe in this, that the carbon thrown into the cycles of summer and winter will cause a spiral in predictable, increasing physical realities of the place. The word will not cease in Hebrew is lo Shabbato. Shabbat meaning to actively stop as opposed to resting. Shabbos activity ceases the marketplace exchanges and all of the frenetic mechanical action of the world, all the digital zinging, all the traveling, all the writing, all the finishing of things into other things. One interrupts the natural order, the ceaseless cycle to cease, to make an in-between, rupting or breaking. Break the 6-day week and make a Shabbat, an event that's exactly not in the natural order. The people are commanded from Sinai. And every 6 years, break the bounds to the field and the seed time and the harvest time and make a stop for justice, make a sabbatical year. And that is a task of humans, and it is a moral choice, this active Shabbato. And we humans, we need to stop. We can make an argument to stop and start, to understand the link from behavior to the turning world. But it will take this sort of argument that is made in many, many flood stories. There is a moment just before these floods when it could be otherwise. Listen to the prophet's warning, say the text. Allow even a corner of the goodness to survive, and the world could be otherwise than destroyed. We could stop here, attentive and thinking. What time is it? Let me say a word about why what I'm asking to do is so hard. To be present in your place, hineni, to God's asking, where are you, is not only the event of attendance. We understand, and how could we not, with our Google Maps and our PDAs, where we are. We feel like we can own and possess place and territory, but we're uncertain about where we are in time and when it is that we should exist. We don't have the time, sorry. We do not have in time, we cannot grasp it. And so we think we have, if not forever, later. In this existential miscalculation, that is the point. And as Ban Ki-moon noted 3 years ago, science has spoken. There is no ambiguity about the message. Time is not on your side. We think that the great interruption of climate change is an event of the far, far future. And look, we're busy, we're worried about ISIS and Ebola and tenure committees and the poor in our own cities and tenure committees. We think that while we need to play the long game, after all, what is religion if not the long game, we can think about the issues some other time. And here's a fundamental problem. For the climate has already changed, as the IPCC has told us. Time is not on our side. The report contained the group's most explicit warning yet about the food supply. Intensified weather conditions have left poor people worse off. This has already happened. Why can this occur in our faces, this hunger, and yet we do not stop? We who worry about missing lunch for this talk. Why, knowing everything, having proof texts and data, do I still act without any real urgency? A few months ago, speaking to my son about the terrible paradox of evil people flourishing and rewarded for greed or for simple carelessness, he reminded me one of our rabbinic arguments that evil people have no share in Olam Haba, the world that will come. And I told him that I thought this argument was entirely unconvincing and overly pious. But in fact, my doubts about Olam Haba, my modern's lack of simple faith in a cosmic system of reward and punishment, is a symptom of a far larger issue. Because there is something else that makes it easy to flee from our duty as we confront climate change. We find it impossible as moderns who live on the always present to imagine our own death. Our version of climate denial is about the denial of our own death. The extent of our being can possibly explain why rational scholars can act as we act, as if the good American life will be stable, and as if we did not denial of death a particular problem in this catastrophe, our inability to imagine a life after us, as any sort of world to come, olam haba. If we cannot imagine a time then in which we will not be here, in our present, with our and our airline travel, our oceans nicely in their places, and then we cannot. But we must imagine it, for if not, they will face it alone, stunned by the thought that if we had acted as if we were mortal, moral agents, the world, the coming one, is a place we can already see if we look, but only if we look at the colors, the women on the ridges of the sand in Bangladesh, the Chinese herders in the great dust cell. But we cannot see them if the world is full of, well, me and my immortal. We are fleeing. We're trying to outrun the coming storm. But we do not have to run. We can stand in our place, in this place, and in our research, and in our teaching, in our academic citizenship, and we could claim our power. Let me explain. Religions, we who excellently study them, have many liabilities and in too many ways have made some things worse. But we might agree that religions have at least 4 powerful capacities. First, religions confront the enormous terror of each of us as we face death, with narratives that allow us to imagine our good life as part of a larger story in which we are mortal and broken and old and yet beloved. Second, religions allow ordinary people to believe that in their own power, believe in their own power to change unjust situations, despite all odds and everything arrayed against them. This idea of the beauty and crystalline brilliance of action, of the value of compassion and repentance, and of the power of humility is so unlike the tropes of American culture and of our academic culture as well that it's even hard to teach it. But it's a vivid truth in our texts and our traditions. There is power there, dangerous and vivid. It is the power to see the most ordinary, the smallest, the most degraded one, the remnant, the lost, the desperate, hungry stranger as your sister who is sitting next to you at Sinai, as the center of the teeming world. Religious language fights for values beyond the marketplace exchange. It holds the last lost tongue of justice. Third, religious traditions allow for prophecy. To imagine the future, to call for repentance, is to see a day coming that can be imagined, changed, redeemed. All of this is possible. The road to the impossible is opened. Calling and wild, irrational with charts and PowerPoints. Come now the activists and the scientists. Comes in the guy in the lab coat. Comes in the farmer. And if you teach religious studies, you'll know them as prophets. And within the traditions that attend to dreamers, they will be heard. Fourth, religions are without borders. Just like medicine can be sans frontières, religions allow us to consider ourselves to be global members of covenants far deeper and far broader than national boundaries. Religions are often strongest in the places where the climate is worst, the global south, where the land lies close to the sea and where clean water is a day's walk away. Understanding the borderless nature of the problem is the first step towards solidarity. As scholars, we understand that we may see the words of desperate warming and burned and discarded by the powerful, who deny a link between moral behavior and the actual world. We know what it is to walk in Nineveh and to despair of change, or to be the smartest outsider in the king's court, the ones who are taught to speak Chaldean or science or politics, to be the interpreter of the terrifying visions of the future. We know what it is to speak against the marketplace and the soldier's order. As scholars who read the texts that show how a human life might be lived in view of God, we are used to disbelief and used to the idea that religion is trivial or naive or simply unrealistic. All I have is words. I have no armies. I have only students, colleagues. All we can do is teach. We can act as moral agents to teach our students to live out our work. We make a living by struggling to understand the truth of the world by speaking parrhesia. And here it's important to note that we like hard inquiry and we believe in skepticism, but we do not believe in ignorance and we do not support the denial of data because we are teachers. We live in a time and we teach at a time when religions are at the center of history, have marched into the center stage, and in the center of the stage enact and speak. Of course, because all real moral agency is based on the idea that real deep evil is a possible choice. Enacted there is both peace and violent war, both attention to the climate and the display of wealth and power that destroys the climate. The moral gesture of teaching and of working at a university is nothing innocent, because every time I live as an American, I'm using 3 times the resources of most. I still get to fly around to my conferences like this. I get to live in hotels far above the beggars eating and drinking and swimming in what we call work, but is laughably more than the dreams of most people in the world. And we will fly home, leaving the white trail of our carbon streaking and crossing the sky, filling it up just this much more. But we must stop, and we must start. We must start to support the peacemakers and the climate protectors and the life sustainers and the scientists. If religious people care about the lives of the poor, then you need to care about the climate. If you care about the lives of women, now you need to care about the climate. If you care about children, then this is what you need to think about, the world to come. Do not think for a minute that you are powerless. We are not powerless. Our scientist colleagues are already in motion. Engineering colleagues are already working, and we need to join them if we're teaching theology. We need to produce the research that describes this moment, to reflect on the text of crisis and collective action, to evoke resources for culture and political change, and to be sure that the one great foe of even the most apolitical scholar, ignorance, is defeated. What time is it? Let that question interrupt you. And here's what the scientists are telling us. This time is right now. Now, I'm not the kind of ethicist that merely describes the issues or throws up her hands and says, oh, well, that's awful. As my teacher, Karen Lebach, warned me in graduate school, we have to make real decisions in this actual world. So finally, here's my 2 decisions. There are some pragmatic signs and acts at the scale in which we work, 2 ways that we can start tithing. So first, I suggested to my colleagues in religion that we had to take a tithe of our time, because everybody says broke, but you all have enough time, in every speech, in every conversation, in every class, make room for the problem of climate change. You don't have to do it the whole time. You can finish the conversation, you can finish teaching the semester, you can still do exegesis or describe the religious practices of Brooklyn Catholics. You can do your translation, whatever you do, you can still do it, but you have to make the corners of your field, say Hebrew Scriptures, and the field is your field that you work in, and that field needs to tend and turn to a tithe, a time tithe. 10 minutes of attention about the very real need to think about our climate in every conversation. Tithe a week, a quarter, 4 hours from the weekly email to actually read the IPCC report. This could be an ongoing part of every work that you do. Tithe your time to talk about the crisis. And second, I propose that we should stop and create a sabbatical year in the next upcoming sabbatical year in Hebrew Scriptures. Jews have counted them for thousands of years. The next one comes in 2021. And in 2021, we create a different kind of year. We don't fly for work, we only fly for love. So I suggested that the American Academy of Religion, the American Academy of History, American Sociology Association, simply not meet that 1 year. Simply tithe that year and stop what you're doing, and instead of flying off to the most wonderful of meetings, which for me was the AAR, spend that time in your own city doing something about the climate with the poor of your own city. If you have to feel the need to give your paper, give it to the janitorial staff and the operational gardener staff of the university, for instance. I don't know what other answers might spring if scholars took seriously tithing and the making a sabbatical year, or other full, serious research attention to the problem of climate change. The year that I gave this paper, fully 1/3 of all the papers in the 10,000 person meeting at the American Academy of Religion addressed the crisis with a variety of methods and texts and interrogations, and that was a very good beginning. I suggest we should continue it. We have to work very hard. In fact, we have to do every single thing we can to live an interrupted life, to live a life of moral attention. That should be the first duty of any scholar. When I was an AAR president, I wanted to be the kind of president that took seriously the prophetic duty of my field, bioethics and Jewish studies, to warn, to speak of the possibility of our power and our responsibility, someone who interrupted you and told you to let the call of the stranger stop you in your tracks and the brokenness of the earth call you to action. And I wanted to be the one who said to you, stop. Stop and now start. And now, every single one of you, and everyone I've spoken to, I can say to you, it is the greatest moral question of our time, and it's no longer my problem alone. It's all of your problems. And I know that each of you can go back to the places, the homes you've come from, and you can be aware of your power to make changes. And I know that if we stand together, we can at least begin. Thank you.